A warm welcome, everybody, to this episode on Western political thought. In this episode, today we will discuss the political thought of John Stuart Mill. His period covers the time 1806 to 1873. In all standard books on Western political thought, John Stuart Mill appears to be a key figure of 19th century British liberal values or liberal tradition. John Stuart Mill, of course, was a liberal thinker. John Stuart Mill is rated as a key figure in British liberal thought. But we have to keep it in mind that John Stuart Mill, although he was a liberal, yet he was a liberal with a difference. So we have to first understand that in what sense John Stuart Mill was a liberal with a difference. To understand this point, we have to first of all consider the question that John Stuart Mill, although he believed in liberal values, liberal norms, liberal philosophy, with its emphasis on freedom, individual rights, etc., yet essentially he belonged to a particular tradition that flourished under liberalism, mainly under the initiative of Jeremy Bentham, whose follower John Stuart Mill was. Now, John Stuart Mill basically was a liberal, but he believed in the philosophy of utilitarianism. In a work very famously titled Utilitarianism, published by John Stuart Mill in 1861, he actually codified his understanding of what utilitarianism is. But to understand John Stuart Mill's concept of utilitarianism, naturally the question that arises is this, and one has to address this question at the very beginning, that we are saying that John Stuart Mill was a follower of Bentham's utilitarianism, and thereby both Bentham and John Stuart Mill shared certain common ideas concerning what is known as utilitarian philosophy. If that be so, that if John Stuart Mill as well as Bentham, well, they both shared the values of utilitarian philosophy, then in what sense John Stuart Mill appears as a person who developed his own very original, unique version of utilitarian philosophy? In other words, the point to be noted is this, that yes, Jeremy Bentham was the founder of utilitarian philosophy. John Stuart Mill definitely followed and thereby embraced utilitarian philosophy of Bentham, yet he made major revisions of Benthamite understanding of utilitarian philosophy. And this is evident in his work, as I have already mentioned, that is Utilitarianism, which was published in the year 1861. Now, to understand this point, what we have to first understand is this. What exactly is the original meaning of utilitarian philosophy as developed by Jeremy Bentham? Bentham, as you perhaps know already, was a person who developed the core philosophy, the core ideas of English utilitarianism. Bentham's understanding was this, and that way Bentham was quite different from, in fact, Bentham very strongly admitted and very strongly asserted that his point of view was quite different from traditional liberal emphasis on rights of the individual, as distinct from classical liberalism's emphasis on the importance of rights, that is individual rights, natural rights, etc. Jeremy Bentham's focus was on the point that instead of rights, instead of focusing on individual rights, we have to consider the importance of any policy, any action, any program in terms of its consequences or in terms of its implications for the general utility of society. If a particular action, if a particular activity, if a particular program, it serves or maximizes one's happiness, then it is acceptable. If it minimizes your suffering, that is acceptable. And if it maximizes your suffering, that is, if it causes pain, then it is not acceptable. In other words, it is the quantum of pleasure or happiness that is the yardstick, that is the criterion for judging whether a particular action, whether a particular program has got to be supported or not. In other words, the point to be noted so far as Bentham is concerned was this: whether I as an individual, I value a particular right. It may be, say, right to freedom of speech, it may be right to freedom of press, it may be, say, right to property, for example. Now, if these rights are taken in abstraction, that is, if it is believed that these rights are valuable in terms of their intrinsic value, then for Bentham this is just not acceptable. Rights themselves do not mean anything. Rights have meaning only if they have a collective utilitarian meaning for society. So this was Bentham's understanding. But it should be noted, and if one looks at Bentham's understanding, then one does not miss this point, that in Benthamite understanding, the focus is on quantitative, aggregate value of pleasure or pain. That is, if in sum, if as a totality, the program or action or policy or activity, it maximizes my pleasure or happiness, that is in terms of quantity, then it is acceptable. If it does not, it is not acceptable. Now, so far as John Stuart Mill is concerned, yes, John Stuart Mill very broadly accepted this philosophy. But I am using the word very broadly. That means that in general, yes, John Stuart Mill endorsed this viewpoint. But John Stuart Mill also differed with Jeremy Bentham, and thereby he made a major revision of Benthamite utilitarianism in three different ways. A very noted commentator on English liberal thought, John Gray, well, he has identified these three basic differences between John Stuart Mill's utilitarianism and Benthamite utilitarianism. So I will now, first of all, very briefly explain these three different points or three different elements underlying what exactly John Stuart Mill meant by his own rather unique version of utilitarian philosophy. So, and after that, I will also very briefly explain that what exactly what exactly underlies, what exactly caused John Stuart Mill's this particular version of utilitarian philosophy. That is, what is the explanation underlying John Stuart Mill's this rather peculiar defense, rather unique defense of utilitarian philosophy, so much so that he is considered as, of course, a follower of utilitarian philosophy, but not strictly a follower of Bentham. So, let us look at these three points which distinguish or which characterize John Stuart Mill's understanding of utilitarian philosophy. The first point is this: John Stuart Mill essentially believed that, after all, when I am to talk in terms of happiness of individual or in terms of pleasure of an individual, then we have to consider the idea of pleasure or happiness in terms of the development of the individual as a moral being. That is, as an individual who has to be considered as an autonomous moral being, my focus should be on the point that whether the so-called maximization of pleasure or maximization of happiness, it is leading to or it is contributing to flourishing of his happiness in a moral sense. That is, whether it is leading to, whether it is promoting his well-being as an individual, that is, his inner moral qualities, whether they are flourishing or not. It is not just quantitative pleasure or quantitative happiness. And this is an understanding which essentially is to be explained in terms of the philosophy of Aristotle. Aristotle's understanding that an individual becomes a true, proper individual only when his moral qualities are able to flourish. It is this understanding which went into the making of John Stuart Mill's understanding of utilitarianism. This is point number 1. Point number 2, John Stuart Mill did not believe, and thereby and it is exactly on this point that he differed with Bentham. John Stuart Mill did not believe in the understanding that just by aggregating pleasures or just by aggregating pains, and that thereby by taking a sum total of pleasure or sum total of pain, you can arrive at a kind of utilitarian understanding of, say, any policy or program. John Stuart Mill's understanding was this. Individuals, well, they vary in their taste, in their understanding, in their perception. There are variations. There is a plurality of values underlying each and every individual. In other words, individuals vary, individuals are pluralistic in their identities, and thereby their values, their norms, their perceptions, their understanding, all these are pluralistic in terms of their orientation. So this notion of pluralism, this notion of variation, this notion of diversity, this is extremely important so far as John Stuart Mill is concerned. It is not just by aggregating pleasure or aggregating pain that you arrive at utilitarian understanding. That is, when you are talking of utility, John Stuart Mill accepts it, but at the same time, he also cautions us that while we talk about utility, we must not ignore the element of variation, element of diversity. That is, there is no one single homogeneous, mechanical, universal, standardized understanding of utilitarianism. This is the second point of John Stuart Mill. The third point is, and there again he differs from Bentham, John Stuart Mill believes in hierarchy of, utilitarian values. That is, hierarchy of pleasure and hierarchy of pains. In other words, what John Stuart Mill tries to argue is this, that when you talk of pleasure or when you talk of pain, when you talk of happiness, when you talk of suffering, there are grades, there are qualities, there are hierarchies of pleasure and hierarchies of pain. In other words, it is not just a mechanical identification. It is not like just a catalogue of pleasures and catalogue of, pain. It is not just certain pleasures and certain pains. Well, on left side you have pleasure, on right side you have pain, and you just catalogue them. You just you just make a list of this terms of this items of happiness or items of suffering. It's not like this. So you have to understand the qualitative difference, say, under pleasure and under pain. That is, there are qualities of pleasure, there are qualities of pain. So, because these actually are all related to individuals. So, individuals are not mechanical entities. Individuals are living beings. Individuals are autonomous human beings. So, you have to understand an individual in terms of his very specific identity. So, this is the third point where again John Stuart Mill differs from Bentham's rather mechanical understanding of utilitarianism. I now come to the last point. That is the point which I very briefly mentioned earlier. That, well, the difference between Bentham and John Stuart Mill, this is evident from what I have said. But the question is that what is the explanation of John Stuart Mill's rather unique understanding of utilitarian philosophy as developed by him in the book published by him in 1861 under the title Utilitarianism. The explanation of John Stuart Mill, which goes into the making of, or rather which went into the making of his rather unique philosophy, may be characterized as the following, or what it can be explained with reference to, say, the following factors. One factor is, as I have already mentioned, John Stuart Mill was essentially a liberal. John Stuart Mill essentially was a liberal in the sense, for him, a very important point was this, in fact this was his point of departure, that is the individual, the autonomy of the individual's liberty, individual's freedom, individual as an autonomous human being, the individual with his, say, notion of happiness, with his notion of suffering. So the individual for John Stuart Mill was the point of departure, individual's defense of freedom, etc. And so he was always very much concerned with the preservation of this autonomy of freedom of the individual. In fact, in the year 1859, when he published one of his most famous works on liberty, in that work, while he focused on the importance of defending the notion of liberty of the individual, all the time he always suffered from a feeling of fear. He always suffered from a feeling of anxiety that this freedom perhaps is under threat, that the freedom can be usurped, the freedom can be jeopardized, freedom can be questioned. By whom? By the rest of society. That is, the so-called masses. They may threaten the unique freedom of the individual. That is, he always suffered from this anxiety, from this feeling of fear, that my specific autonomy, my specific notion of identity, my specific notion of freedom, well, it may be threatened or jeopardized by the masses. That is the collective that is the majority, the collective majority, the will of the majority, the demands of the majority. They may cause a kind of threat to my specific individual existence, individual freedom. And therefore, at any cost, whatever be the policy, whatever be the program, and John Stuart Mill, in terms of defense of utilitarian philosophy, he of course defended the point, which was in fact the point of Bentham also, that if in the collective interest of society, if in the collective, or if guided by collective utilitarian considerations of society, you have to defend, you have to justify, you have to endorse a government policy, a government program, yes, that is most welcome. But while welcoming it at the same time one has to keep it in mind that in the name of promotion of a particular policy, which is supposed to serve the utilitarian, the collective considerations of society, and thereby it will serve the cause of utility, it must not also pose a threat. It must not also cause a kind of, say, danger to the identity of the individual. So the individual at any cost, his rights, his freedom has got to be safeguarded. So this was John Stuart Mill's abiding concern throughout his life. And in this understanding, he was actually guided by two very important, one can say, two very important philosophical influences. These two philosophical influences, the two philosophical currents, made a big impact on him. Please remember that John Stuart Mill was a versatile scholar. He was trained in Greek, he was trained in Latin, he had a very good exposure to European philosophy. So he was of course an Englishman. He of course was absolutely familiar with the philosophical trends, the intellectual currents of his time. But he was also acquainted with other trends which were not just English, which were other than, say, English philosophy. That is, he was conversant with German philosophy, he was conversant with other European philosophies. So if we keep these factors in mind, then one can identify, as I was saying, two very important trends in philosophy, or two very important trends in European thought, which made an impact in two different ways on John Stuart Mill. One was, I have already mentioned it, one was Greek philosophy, particularly Aristotle. Aristotle's understanding that after all, an individual becomes a true and proper individual only when it is possible for that individual to develop himself as a moral being. And thereby, only by becoming a true, proper moral being, it is possible for the individual to develop his qualities. That is, therefore, every attempt should be made whereby it will be possible for an individual to develop himself as a moral being. Thereby, steps will have to be taken so that it is possible for the moral qualities of an individual to flourish. So, allowing the moral qualities of the individual to flourish, allowing the moral attributes of an individual to further develop, well, that will be the real meaning of a true, proper, enlightened individual. So this ethical understanding of man, and please note, the focus is on individual, the focus is on man. That is how it is possible for an individual to develop himself or herself as a moral being. This is a typical Greek concern, this is a typical Aristotelian concern. So this understanding went into the making of John Stuart Mill's rather unique utilitarian philosophy, which distinguished him from the understanding of utilitarianism as shared by Jeremy Bentham. This shift from quantity to quality, because when you can understand, when one talks about ethical qualities, when one talks about moral development of the individual, the focus is not on quantity. The focus is not on the quantum of pleasure or quantum of pain. The focus is on quality, the qualitative development of an individual. How it is possible for an individual to develop himself or herself as a moral being. So this is one trend, one particular kind of focus of John Stuart Mill. That is John Stuart Mill's, or on John Stuart Mill, the impact of Aristotelian philosophy. This is one which explains John Stuart Mill's concern for the freedom of the individual, autonomy of the individual. And remember, when one talks about this autonomy of individual as a moral being, typical Aristotelian understanding. So this is one. What is the other current? And the other current was the Romantic movement, the German Romantic movement. German Romanticism was another very powerful current in contemporary Europe, which actually focused on celebration of individual sentiment, individuals' emotions, individuals' moral qualities, individuals' identity, celebration of the self of the individual. So this was another current which also motivated John Stuart Mill in a very big way to focus on the individual. So by way of conclusion, what we can say is this: John Stuart Mill, of course, was utilitarian. John Stuart Mill, of course, shared the basic philosophy of utilitarianism as developed by Jeremy Bentham, but he also was a kind of follower of utilitarianism which tried to focus on, say, a kind of synthesis of liberalism's emphasis on individual freedom and utilitarian's emphasis on collective utility of society. Thank you.